Thank you. There's a microphone here?
There is.
Okay, so you can hear me then?
Yes.
Okay, terrific, terrific. I wish to begin first by acknowledging and invoking gratitude for my teachers, past, present, and future. I've been asked to address two issues for this panel that have been presented as though they are concomitant. The first of these is whether we can say there was homosexuality prior to the 19th century when the term was coined. The second issue is regarding the relevance or impact of how we view the sexual ethos of the past on contemporary activism for gender and sexual minorities, in the Middle East specifically. The term Middle East, of course, has been rendered problematic by many scholars in the field. It's the middle of where, middle and east in relation to what and to whom. I could very easily be talking about Southwest Asia. But these labels, homosexual and Middle East, with sufficient homage paid to Foucault and the post-structuralist critique, need not be seen as pernicious when we acknowledge that labels result from the inevitability of having to conjure the local and the relational for the purposes of legibility. To point this out, of course, is not to deny the power asymmetries that result from the production and dissemination of certain labels and categories in place of others, or the political baggage that orbits representations. However, in my view, the project of contesting and destabilizing taxonomies of sexuality and location needs to be invoked at the level of the local, just as much as it seems to be invoked at the level of the global. And to my mind, this is what grassroots activism in the Middle East is doing. It is interrogating local hegemonies and seeking to resist and rewrite taxonomies. I refer to it as grassroots in order to distinguish those activist clusters that emerged organically from the womb of the civil societies that birthed them from those that were artificially installed or externally imposed. It is not necessary to prove or argue successfully that homosexuality, however way defined, existed in a tolerant past in order to vindicate contemporary gender and sexual activism in global and regional politics. These are separate issues. So long as native populations have determined for themselves the wish to enter into such debates and agitations, then this is the vindication itself. It is not even necessary to prove that the empire and its economic apparatus, that is capitalism, did not recently create a brand of sexuality and gender which previously did not exist, as John D'Amelio, David Halperin, and by implication Professor Masad have argued. The fact is that these minorities are telling us that they exist now, and they enjoy a rich and diverse cultural output to prove it. We do not need to approach occasional conceptual migrations or cultural borrowings with an anxiety of contamination. As Kristen Walker pointed out in her critique of John D'Amelio, globalization is not necessarily a one-way process, and where one culture draws on the traditions of another culture, it will do so in a way that transforms the cultural traditions being appropriated. Thus, the result of globalization is hybridity rather than homogeneity." End quote. In her book, Queering India, Ruth Vanita points out that it's usual for those who have already obtained most of their basic civil rights and liberties in first world environments to object to the use of terms such as gay and lesbian as Western and therefore inappropriate in third world contexts. I add to this that it is also usual for those for whom the stigma and or potential for persecution is imminent to rightly find these terms deleterious. I am in partial agreement with Professor Masad when I recognize that bourgeois agitations are more often than not ill-equipped to address the needs and concerns of those who are socio-economically underprivileged, and in full agreement with him on the question of holding LGBT activists in the Middle East accountable should their activism fail to take class privilege into consideration. Nonetheless, for me, this failure, when enacted, because it is not always invariably enacted, is not tantamount to violence. To point out the cerebral function of bourgeois intellectualism in the engine of social revolutions is not the same as demonstrating that that cerebral function is in league with the legacies of colonialism or the project of empire. The use of categories such as LGBT, heterosexual, or homosexual are not, in my view, universally pernicious when applied to the Middle East, nor are they inevitably ontologically corrosive. More often than not, they are a result of a continuum of human experience which makes self and other intelligible. To say this, of course, is not to say that a continued contestation of hegemonic definitions and categories is not absolutely essential for activism, because it is. This also includes the interrogation of whether the right to sexual self-determination can be universally applicable, or whether pursuing this and enshrining it in international law would lead to the best possible outcomes. Kristen Walker, to whom I owe both the problematization and the coining of the term sexual self-determination, and more recently Matthew Waits, have led a critique of precisely these issues, including a critique of the use of rubrics such as LGBT, sexual orientation, gender identity within human rights discourses. I refer particularly to the deployment of these in the Yogyakarta Principles, in the Montreal Declaration, and in the EU Declaration on Human Rights. Waits proffered as co-editor a special issue of Contemporary Politics in 2009, which interrogated the problem of the incomplete in the discursive rights frameworks being fashioned at the level of international law. Yet he maintains that, in light of the mutability of sexual orientation and implicitly gender identity, it is not necessary to argue for the abandonment of these concepts in human rights struggles. However, it is necessary for political and human rights literature, NGOs and activists allied to a radical sexual politics to note the exclusionary effects of using such concepts within currently dominant discursive frames in order to transform their dominant meanings. So it is essential for us to eviscerate concepts such as homosexual, heterosexual, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, intersex, concepts such as rights and human rights and sexual rights, and concepts such as sexual orientation and gender identity, and even freedom and justice, in order to locate the exclusions, the culturally relative exclusions that they enact, and as Waits' right to resist and transform their dominant meanings. But eviscerating these and problematizing their incompleteness or inadequacy in accounting for all there is and all that is required of them, without also recognizing their utilitarian and functional necessity in the ongoing contest for justice, is singularly unhelpful. As Judith Butler reminds us, part of the project of hegemony is precisely to allow for the possibility of shifting and expanding its borders. Thus, hegemony is in flux, moving to subsume and normativize what has been previously excluded. In this light, resistance may be as necessary as it is ultimately futile, since hegemony will produce new normativities and thus new exclusions. Nevertheless, there is an inconsistency in the application of our analyses as queer theorists or social constructionists that I've often found troubling. We have perhaps inadvertently given exceptionalism to and have not been eviscerating or destabilizing certain conclusions about sexuality, and also how to approach the question of the human. So much so that the assumptions and conclusions on which much of queer theory and social constructionism are founded have had the unintended effect of producing orthodoxies. The most entrenched orthodoxy in theory is that exclusive homosexual desire and or love can only be produced at the site of certain preconditions, the features of which can only be found in modernity. How can we satisfy ourselves with the creationist myth that that to which homosexuality refers is not only socially constructed, but manufactured, and also give credit for this invention exclusively to Western capitalist society of the 20th century? What kind of anthropocentric and ethnocentric presumption is required to give patent rights to humanity, and then more specifically to the West, for a phenomenon that sweeps across human and non-human cultures past and present, a phenomenon that we barely comprehend and already have too much trouble defining along an unsatisfactory binary of behavior at one end and identity at the other? The post-structuralist critique would not be amenable to an approach which claims that there is homosexuality in the non-human world, such as the one I have invoked, since the criteria for locating the homosexual and non-human, and indeed in the human as well, requires a very human mediation and the imposition of an essentially arbitrary criteria that reveals more about the mediator's archaeology of knowledge rather than anything outside of this framework. Sexuality, in view of this orthodoxy, is nothing more than a concept recently invented, and by extension then, everything is a product of the mind, which is essentially, always universally, a product of society. I am interested in interrogating the epistemological solipsism of this approach. It appears to me that here is the site of its aphoretic disintegration. I am interested in the meta-human material conditions, the pre-discursive foundations, upon and around which the discursive must needs be built. The constructionist view seems to offer a monodirectional top-down model for the fashioning of sexual desires, activities, and, if applicable, identities. The teleology is perhaps overly simplistic. If the organization of erotic life also follows a bottom-up approach, no pun intended, would it not then be legitimate to consider the body with its various mechanisms for birthing and sustaining the erotic system as the initial location of the sexual? The social might then enter to condition and reform, to discipline the body according to the limits and liminalities of the bidden and forbidden, producing a fractured continuisms of homosexualities among others. I am not convinced that non-identitarian sexual practice can uniformly fail to lead to intimacies and contingent desires such as the desire for companionship or romantic love, even if these desires cannot be realized materially, are repressed, or are absent from the instantiation of many same-sex sexual acts. Thus, homosexuality is opened up to a resistance of definition, to its myriad of possibilities and actualities as shifting, unstable, and queer. It is this homosexuality, as it is constituted phenomenologically, as a spectre that haunts actions and desires, rather than as an object which can be said to have existed in the past and in the present, both within and beyond the dominant understanding of the homosexual or the human. If David Halpern offered an instructive and illuminating manual on how to do the history of homosexuality, then what I am about to do is to offer a suggestion how to undo the history of homosexuality. For after all, the history of homosexuality is itself materially contingent on the structures of empire that make it possible, the modern university system, and the intellectual hegemony which determines which methodologies are enshrined as intellectually legitimate and which are not, which research directives are to be funded and brought into existence and which are not, who is imbued with the authority and credentials to be published, studied, and read, and who is not. Given this, it is not surprising that we are and have been largely preoccupied with a dizzying exotification of human differences. It is in the interest of the project of empire to obscure what makes humans the same in favor of what makes them different, and to proliferate as much talk of difference as possible in the successful effort to sustain its military and economic incursions. In their contest for supremacy, the empires, for there are more than one, can only sustain themselves through busying us with puzzlement over perpetual civilizational incommensurabilities. In light of this, we might do well to reconsider the valence of human universals in theory, particularly the material conditions which have led to our aversion of serious considerations of these in our ongoing effort to comprehend the human condition, and, if you believe in the promise of it, the project of justice. I will limit my remaining comments to a consideration of sexual love and or lust between women in exemplary pre-modern Arabic texts. I will further limit myself to sharing citations that invoke the spectre of the homosexual, and I should emphasize that I am necessarily performing an exclusion of the significant inconsistencies in other examples that fall outside of this purview. My aim is never to undermine or deny the gender sexual fluidities that explode the Homo formative, but simply to indicate that some perennial features of the erotic system, to borrow Valerie Traub's expression, render humans across vast expanses of time and space and individual experience not only intelligible to each other, but in some ways, dare I say it, not that different. In an article which bears great relevance to tonight's debate, Sahar Amir suggests that same-sex loving Arab women would do well to excavate Arabic discourse of the pre-modern period in order to enrich contemporary Arabic terminology with names and sexual signifiers that are culturally relevant and that can move beyond the prism of lesbian, gay, bisexual, or queer. She further illuminates that in the 9th century book Al-Fahras, An-Nadim listed the names of 12 same-sex female couples who were known in the 10th century, but about whom nothing else has been preserved. Because An-Nadim listed every Arabic book of which he was aware, we know from his inventory about the existence of 12 works dating before the end of the 10th century that were devoted to named lesbian couples, end quote. The summarized stories of 2 of these couples have been penned by 9th century scholar Al-Yamani. They are the story of Hind and Hassan Yamani's daughter and the story of Najda and Rughum. In the interest of time, I'll share Yamani's story of the story of Rughum and Najda. He writes, They romanced each other and became famous for their grinding, which is the word to denote sexual activity between women, until Ruhum's brother was taunted for his sister's behavior. So he waited until he came upon them one day as they were having intercourse. So he killed Najda and took his sister away with him. Ruhum incited Najda's people to kill her brother, and a war erupted between them. This serves as an indication of the greatness of the pleasure they find in grinding, as well as an indication of their preference for grinding over the pleasure with men." End quote. The clear erotic preference of these women, as admitted begrudgingly by Yemeni, and in combination with their romantic involvement, takes us beyond sex as a practice and raises the specter of the allegedly modern homosexual. Ruhum's brother's actions confirm that the view that this behavior was not entirely normalized, nor was it uniformly rejected either, since Ruhum's incitement of Najda's tribe against her own brother was successful. Later in the same chapter, Yemeni describes a series of written exchanges between women who articulate desire for men. He calls them muttaqiya, which means pious or secluded. She fears God, God-fearing. And women who articulate desire for women, called suhaqiya, meaning a grinder. In such instances, the articulation of these desires are mutually exclusive. For example, the muttaqiya remarks, "I'm not indignant with you because you tried to shame what you don't know, and you have prescribed what you have not tried. No one who hasn't tasted it knows the worth of honey, and whomsoever has yet to smell musk does not know its glory." The muttaqiya identifies the grinder as a woman who has only had sex with women, and reasons that she is therefore in no position to comment on the superiority of that sex with men. What is also interesting is the question as to why the grinder does not feel at any point compelled to or interested in trying sex with men. The grinder in her earlier writings to the muttaqiya locates sexual desire for women purely in the realm of the body of the other woman and the excitation that this produces. The muttaqiya does not share in this excitation. If we locate the absence of interest in sex with men within society, the top-down approach, we might come up with several culturally specific rationalizations. Fornication was severely forbidden. Avoidance of scandal and the fear of pregnancy have also been suggested elsewhere in the same literature, for example. But if we locate this interest in the body's response to stimulus, the bottom-up approach, then the specter of the homosexual and indeed the heterosexual emerges. What's more, the banter between these two pre-modern women is delineated along lines of their distinction from each other. This distinction was demarcated along a muttaqiya grinder binary, a binary that translates comfortably into that to which the modern categories of hetero and homo refer. Sexual performativity produced legible identities in this exchange. This performativity was not suspended simply as practice. In a 13th century text penned by Tunisian scholar Ahmed Tifashi, Tifashi goes on to describe not singular instances of same-sex desiring women, but rather a community of them. He writes, "And I know that this matter is known among its mistresses, arbab, as wit, dharaf, and by this name they are called, meaning they call themselves. The witty ones, dharifat. So if they said that so-and-so is witty, dharifa, then it becomes known amongst them that she is a grinder." Interestingly, Tifashi tells us that a community of women existed who disseminated a code word among each other, the code word being dharifa, and this code word was used among them to help them identify each other. These texts do not preclude the possibility that same-sex desire, practice, and identification existed in societies not punctuated by the features and concerns of modernity. The women who are socially categorized according to their acts, their grinding, consequently produced identities, dharifat, and in this instance, a community. The fraction of the great corpus of erythological literature produced in 9th century Arabia that survived the Mongolian burning of the great library of Baghdad in the 13th century points to a very lively discourse on sexuality, and if not sexuality, then on that to which sexuality refers. I shall close with a citation of a 9th century scholar named Muthanna bin Zuhair. Since this citation falls outside of the purview of the modern West, both temporally and geographically, it does well to singularly unravel the orthodoxies produced by the history of sexuality and the history of homosexuality as they have been fashioned in the North American institution. I've never seen anything in man and woman that I haven't seen in the male and female pigeons. I've seen a female pigeon who mounts male ones, and one who mounts other female ones. I've seen pigeons who mount nothing beside other female pigeons, and I've seen one who mounts female ones but does not allow them to mount her. I've seen a male who mounts one who then mounts him in return. I have seen a female feign maleness and who does not allow another to mount her. I have seen all of these kinds in grinders, feminine and masculine ones, and also among men who are inseparable companions and lutiyin, so we might translate that as sodomites. There are men who do not want women, and women who do not want men. End quote.